The jungle breathed at night. It was not silent, never silent, but alive with a chorus that made men question what was real and what was imagined. On the northern slope of a nameless ridge overlooking Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, 800 United States Marines lay in shallow foxholes and listened to the island speak. Insects droned in waves that rose and fell like tides. Fruit bats swept overhead, their wings cutting the humid air with sounds like tearing silk. Somewhere in the darkness, a bird screamed, high and sharp, and then fell silent as though strangled. The rain had stopped an hour before, but water still dripped from the canopy above, pattering onto helmets and ponchos with a regular rhythm that could drive a man to madness if he let it. The earth smelled of rot and growth, of vegetation dying and being born in the same breath, and beneath it all lay another smell, faint but unmistakable, the sweetish, cloying odor of death that had begun to permeate every corner of this accursed island. It was the night of September 12, 1942, and Colonel Merritt Edson knew that his Marines were about to be tested as they had never been tested before. Red Mike, they called him, for the ruddy complexion and the shock of hair that had once been flame-bright but was now fading toward iron gray. He was 45 years old, a career Marine who had seen action in Nicaragua and China, a man whose face seemed carved from harder wood than most. He moved along the ridge now in the darkness, a shadow among shadows, stopping at each fighting position to speak quietly with his men. His voice carried no false cheer, no theatrical bravado. He told them what they already knew, that the Japanese were coming, that they would come in numbers, that the night would be long. He told them that Henderson Field lay behind them, that if the airstrip fell the Japanese would own the skies over the Solomons, that everything depended on this ridge, on this night, on them. The Marines listened and nodded, their faces invisible in the darkness, but their tension palpable. Some were raiders, members of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion that Edson himself had trained to a razor's edge. Others were para-Marines, elite airborne troops who had been thrown into the line when the situation grew desperate. All of them were exhausted, ravaged by dysentery and malaria, underfed and undersupplied, and all of them understood that they were being asked to hold against odds that would have seemed absurd in any war college classroom back in the world they had left behind. The ridge itself was unremarkable in appearance, a low spine of coral and volcanic rock running roughly north to south, covered in kunai grass that grew waist-high and dotted with sparse jungle. It rose perhaps 50 feet above the surrounding terrain at its highest point, a gentle slope on the southern end that steepened toward the north where the jungle thickened and darkened into an impenetrable wall. Henderson Field lay less than 1,000 yards to the south, its single runway scraped from the jungle by Japanese engineers and seized by the Marines in the initial landing 6 weeks earlier. That airfield was everything. From it, American aircraft could reach the supply convoys that kept the Japanese garrisons alive throughout the Solomons. From it, fighters and dive bombers could intercept the enemy warships that prowled these waters like hungry sharks. Lose Henderson Field and the entire Guadalcanal operation would collapse. Lose Henderson Field and thousands of Marines would be cut off, surrounded, methodically destroyed. The High Command knew it, the Japanese knew it, and every man on that ridge knew it with a certainty that sat in their bellies like cold lead. Intelligence reports, cobbled together from native scouts and aerial reconnaissance, suggested that a major Japanese force was moving through the jungle toward the ridge. The estimates varied wildly, 2,000 men, 3,000, perhaps more. They were elements of the Kawaguchi Brigade, seasoned troops under Colonel Kaineo Kawaguchi, a commander who had tasted victory in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, and who fully expected to taste it again here. The Japanese plan was straightforward. A night assault, overwhelming force concentrated on a narrow front, break through the Marine lines and sweep down to Henderson Field before dawn. It was the sort of plan that had worked a dozen times before across the Pacific, where Japanese infantry had carved through defensive positions with bayonet charges and fanatical courage that seemed to defy all rational calculation. But the Japanese had not yet faced Marines in a defensive position where retreat was impossible and where every man understood that failure meant the death of his brothers. They were about to discover what that kind of desperation could produce. Edson returned to his command post, a shallow hole scraped into the ridge's highest point, and studied his maps by the dim glow of a red-filtered flashlight. The positions were thin, dangerously thin. He had been forced to stretch his 800 men across nearly 1,000 yards of front, which meant gaps, weak points, places where a determined enemy could punch through if they found them in the darkness. He had positioned his raiders and paramarines in a horseshoe shape along the ridge's southern approaches, with machine gun positions at the most likely avenues of attack and mortar crews dug in on the reverse slope where they could fire in support without exposing themselves to direct assault. Artillery support would come from the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, positioned near Henderson Field with their 105s zeroed in on the jungle approaches. It would have to be enough. There were no reserves, no fresh troops waiting in the wings. Every able-bodied Marine on the island was already committed, already fighting for his life in one sector or another. This was it, the absolute edge of American capability in the South Pacific in the autumn of 1942, and if these 800 men broke, there was nothing behind them but the sea. The first probing attacks came just after dark, around 8 o'clock. Rifle fire crackled from the northern edge of the perimeter, sharp and sudden, and then died away. A Marine corporal reported movement in the kunai grass, shadows that might have been men or might have been the wind. Edson ordered his men to hold fire unless they had clear targets, to conserve ammunition, to stay calm. The minutes crawled past. The jungle sounds resumed, insects and birds and the eternal dripping of water. Some of the Marines whispered to each other, nervous conversation that trailed off into silence. Others simply waited, their rifles cradled in their arms, their eyes straining against the darkness that pressed in from all sides like something physical. The moon rose, a thin crescent that gave almost no light, and the stars were obscured by cloud cover that had rolled in with the evening. It was the kind of darkness that city boys had never experienced, the kind that made a man feel as though he had gone blind, and in that darkness the waiting became its own form of torture. The Japanese attacked in earnest just before midnight. There was no warning, no preliminary bombardment, just a sudden eruption of rifle and machine gun fire from the jungle to the north, muzzle flashes winking like fireflies, and then the sound of men screaming. Not the agonized screams of the wounded but high, shrill battle cries, bonsai charges that came rolling up the ridge in waves of fury and flesh. The Marines opened fire, their Browning machine guns hammering out long bursts that cut through the kunai grass and dropped the first wave of attackers in tangled heaps. But more came behind them, and more behind them. A seemingly endless tide of soldiers who charged forward with bayonets fixed and grenades clutched in their fists. The noise became deafening. A roar of gunfire and explosions and men shouting in 2 languages, orders and curses and prayers all blending into a single inarticulate howl. Tracers arced through the darkness, red and green, drawing bright lines that burned themselves into the retinas of anyone foolish enough to watch. Mortar rounds began to fall among the Marine positions, detonating with sharp cracks that sent shrapnel whining through the air and threw up geysers of dirt and coral. Edson stood at his command post and directed the defense with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural. He spoke into field telephones, calling down artillery fire from the guns near Henderson Field, adjusting coordinates as the Japanese shifted their attacks from one sector to another. He sent runners sprinting through the darkness with orders to reinforce weak points, to shift machine guns, to hold at all costs. Around him, the ridge had become a vision of hell, lit by muzzle flashes and explosions, choked with smoke and the screams of dying men. Japanese soldiers broke through the outer perimeter in several places, and hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. Marines clubbing with rifle butts and stabbing with bayonets and knives, grunting and gasping as they killed at arm's length. A Japanese officer appeared out of the smoke 10 yards from Edson's command post, waving a sword and shouting, and was cut down by a burst of Thompson submachine gun fire that sent him spinning backward into the kunai grass. The sword clattered against the coral, its blade catching the light for an instant before disappearing into shadow. By 2 in the morning, the situation had become critical. The Japanese had driven a wedge into the center of the Marine line, forcing Edson to pull his men back to a tighter perimeter on the highest ground. The withdrawal was conducted in stages, squads leapfrogging backward while their comrades provided covering fire, dragging their wounded with them and leaving their dead where they fell. The Japanese pressed forward, sensing weakness, pouring more men into the gap. For a few terrible minutes it seemed as though the line would shatter entirely. that the Marines would be overrun and scattered and destroyed piecemeal in the darkness. But Edson refused to panic. He called down a concentration of artillery fire on his own former positions. Danger close, shells screaming in so near that their concussions slapped the air from Marine lungs and left men's ears ringing. The barrage tore into the advancing Japanese, killing dozens and throwing the assault into confusion. When the smoke cleared, the Marines still held the high ground, bloodied and reduced but unbroken. The attacks continued throughout the night, wave after wave, each one crashing against the Marine defenses like surf against a seawall. The Japanese fought with a ferocity that stunned even the most experienced Marines. Men who threw themselves forward into machine gun fire without hesitation, who continued to advance even with mortal wounds, who clawed their way up the ridge's slopes with a determination that seemed to transcend the merely human. But the Marines gave no ground. They fired until their barrels glowed red, until their ammunition ran low and they had to scavenge clips and belts from the dead. They threw grenades until their arms ached, hurling the pineapple-shaped bombs down the slope where they detonated among clusters of Japanese soldiers with flat, vicious cracks. They fixed bayonets and waited in their foxholes, and when the enemy came close enough they rose and fought with a savagery that matched anything the Japanese could bring. This was not war as doctrine prescribed it, not maneuver and tactics and clever flanking movements. This was attrition, pure and simple, a grinding contest of wills in which the side that broke first would be annihilated. Edson moved through it all like a man possessed, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest, his voice cutting through the chaos with orders that were clear and precise. He seemed to bear a charmed life, walking upright through storms of fire that dropped men on either side of him, pausing to drag wounded Marines to safety or to take up a rifle and fire at targets that emerged from the darkness. His calm was infectious, a steady presence that reminded his men that they were Marines, that they had been trained for this, that they could and would prevail if they simply refused to quit. Years later, survivors would remember his voice more than anything else, that flat Vermont accent delivering orders with the same tone he might have used to discuss the weather, as though the apocalypse unfolding around him was merely a problem to be solved through competence and will. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, the sky lightening by degrees from black to charcoal to gray. The firing tapered off as the darkness lifted, sporadic bursts and single shots replacing the continuous roar that had defined the night. The Japanese pulled back into the jungle, dragging their wounded and leaving their dead scattered across the slopes of the ridge like discarded dolls. The Marines remained in their positions, filthy and exhausted, staring out at the carnage with eyes that had gone flat and distant. The kunai grass was trampled and stained dark, littered with equipment and weapons and bodies in poses of violent death. Smoke drifted across the ridge in lazy tendrils, and the air stank of cordite and blood and the peculiar burnt meat smell that comes from high explosives detonating near human flesh. Medics moved among the wounded, working with desperate efficiency to save those who could be saved, and chaplains followed behind them, offering what comfort they could to men whose faith had been tested in the furnace of the night. Edson walked the line, inspecting his positions, counting heads, assessing damage. He found gaps where entire squads had been wiped out, positions where only 1 or 2 Marines remained alive from groups that had numbered 8 or 10 when darkness fell. He found machine guns with their crews dead around them, the weapons themselves still pointing toward the enemy, barrels warped from sustained fire. He found men who had fought on after being wounded, who had continued to load and fire and kill even as their own blood pooled in the bottoms of their foxholes. He spoke to them quietly, thanking them, telling them they had done well, and then he returned to his command post and made preparations for the next night because he knew with absolute certainty that the Japanese would come again. They came at dusk on the 13th, and this time they came with even greater numbers. The Kawaguchi Brigade reinforced with fresh troops who had force-marched through the jungle all day to join the assault. The pattern repeated itself, waves of infantry charging up the ridge through machine gun fire and artillery, fighting their way forward meter by bloody meter, dying in heaps but never faltering. The Marines held, though the cost was appalling. Ammunition ran dangerously low, forcing riflemen to make every shot count, to pick their targets with care even as the enemy swarmed toward them in the darkness. Water ran out, and men fought with throats so parched they could barely swallow, their lips cracked and bleeding. Medical supplies dwindled to nothing, and the wounded received only the most rudimentary care. Morphine if they were lucky, a canteen of water if they were not. Still they held, because Edson had told them they would hold, because the man to their left and the man to their right depended on them holding, because there was nowhere to retreat to and no possibility of rescue if they failed. The worst moment came near midnight when a Japanese battalion broke through on the eastern flank, penetrating deep into the Marine rear area before being discovered. For 20 minutes, chaos reigned as cooks and clerks and radio operators grabbed rifles and fought desperately to contain the breakthrough. Edson himself led a counterattack, forming a scratch force from anyone who could hold a weapon and driving forward into the melee. The fighting was intimate and vicious, men grappling in the darkness, silhouettes merging and separating as they struggled and killed. A Japanese grenade exploded among the counterattacking Marines, killing 3 and wounding 5 more, and for an instant the attack faltered. But Edson kept moving forward, firing his pistol at point-blank range, and his example galvanized the men around him. They surged ahead, pushing the Japanese back, sealing the breach with their bodies. When it was over, Edson stood among the corpses, breathing hard, his uniform torn and stained, and looked at the men who had followed him into that darkness. He said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They had done what needed doing and they were still alive, and that was enough. The second dawn found the ridge still in Marine hands, though by the narrowest of margins. The Japanese withdrew again, this time in greater disorder, leaving behind more than 700 dead sprawled across the approaches to the ridge. The Marines counted their own losses, 59 killed, nearly 200 wounded, and dozens more who were simply at the end of their endurance, men who sat in their foxholes with their rifles across their knees and stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. But they had held, against odds that would later be calculated at better than 3 to 1, against an enemy that had swept through the Pacific with apparent ease, against every rational expectation, they had held. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The aircraft parked along its runway remained safe. The supply lines remained open, and the Japanese High Command, receiving reports from Kawaguchi that the ridge could not be taken, began to understand that their assessment of American fighting spirit might have been catastrophically wrong. The battle would continue in sporadic form for another day, with smaller Japanese attacks probing for weakness, but the crisis had passed. Reinforcements arrived, fresh troops who relieved the exhausted defenders and took up positions along the ridge. Edson and his raiders and Paramarines were pulled back to Henderson Field for rest and reorganization, walking down from the ridge in a long, straggling column that moved like men in a trance. They did not speak much. There was little to say. They had survived something that should have killed them all, and the fact of that survival was almost harder to process than the battle itself. Some men wept quietly as they walked, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on their faces. Others simply put one foot in front of the other, their minds carefully blank, postponing any reckoning with what they had experienced until they were somewhere safe enough to think about it without falling apart. In the weeks that followed, the ridge was officially named Edson's Ridge, though the Marines who had fought there called it Bloody Ridge and the name stuck. Edson himself was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership, though he accepted it with the quiet modesty that characterized everything he did, deflecting praise to the men who had done the fighting and the dying. The raiders and Paramarines were lionized in press reports back home, held up as examples of American courage and fighting prowess, and the Battle of Edson's Ridge entered the Marine Corps pantheon alongside Below Wood and Wake Island as proof of what Marines could accomplish when pushed to the absolute limit. But the men who had been there knew the truth that no medal citation could capture, no newspaper article could convey. They knew that war was not glorious, that courage was often just the inability to think of any alternative, that men died in ways that were ugly and senseless and final. They knew that they had been granted a victory at a price that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, that some part of them had been left on that ridge in the darkness and would never be recovered. They had learned that the human body could be destroyed with shocking ease, that the line between living and dead was far thinner than anyone in peacetime could imagine, that the smell of death was something that would never entirely leave their nostrils no matter how many years passed. The strategic significance of Edson's Ridge became clear in the months that followed. The Japanese never again came close to recapturing Henderson Field. The airstrip expanded, became a major base, and from it American air power systematically dismantled Japanese attempts to resupply their garrison on Guadalcanal. The Tokyo Express, the fast destroyer runs that had kept the Japanese troops alive, became suicide missions as American aircraft intercepted them with increasing effectiveness. Japanese soldiers began to starve in the jungle, reduced to eating roots and grubs and the flesh of their own dead. By February of 1943, the Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal entirely, abandoning the island to the Americans and marking the first major defeat of Japanese ground forces in the Pacific War. That defeat began on a nameless ridge in mid-September of 1942, where 800 Marines proved that the Japanese were not invincible, that their willingness to die did not guarantee victory, that Americans could meet them in the darkness and emerge victorious. It was a lesson purchased in blood, paid for by men who were mostly in their teens and early 20s, who had been civilians just months before, who had left behind families and girlfriends and futures to come to this fever-haunted island and stand in the way of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. They stopped them, not through superior equipment or numbers, not through brilliant tactics or technological advantage, but through simple, stubborn refusal to break. They held because they had been ordered to hold, because the men next to them were holding, because failure was unthinkable and death was preferable to disgrace. Years later, historians would analyze the Battle of Edson's Ridge, would draw lessons about leadership and tactics and the importance of terrain. They would note Edson's calm under fire, his effective use of artillery support, his ability to read the battle and shift his forces to meet each new threat. They would praise the Marines' discipline and training, their ability to function as a cohesive unit even in the chaos of night combat. All of this was true, but it missed something essential, something that could only be understood by those who were there. What won the battle was not doctrine or training or weapons, though all of those helped. What won was the decision, made individually by hundreds of men in the darkness, that they would not quit, that they would keep fighting no matter what came at them out of that jungle, that they would hold their ground or die on it because there was no third option. That kind of resolve cannot be taught or instilled or ordered into existence. It can only be tested, and on Edson's Ridge it was tested to the point of destruction and found sufficient. The ridge itself returned to jungle soon enough, the shell holes filling in with vegetation, the kunai grass covering the scars of battle. But the name remained, a memorial to what had happened there. A reminder that there are moments in war when everything hangs by the thinnest of threads, and only the courage of ordinary men keeps the thread from breaking. Edson's Ridge stands in Marine Corps history not just as a victory but as a testament to what is possible when men are pushed beyond all reasonable limits and somehow find the strength to endure. It is a story of 800 Marines who held a ridge against 3,000 Japanese soldiers through 2 nights of combat that should have destroyed them, and who emerged on the other side having changed the course of a war. They paid for it in full, those 800 men. 59 of them never left the ridge, their bodies buried in the coral soil they had defended. Nearly 200 more carried wounds that would mark them for life, scars both visible and invisible that would serve as permanent reminders of those nights in September. And all of them, even those who emerged physically unscathed, carried something else away from that ridge. A knowledge of what men can do to each other when stripped of civilization's restraints, a memory of darkness and fire and blood that would surface in nightmares for decades to come. They had seen the worst that war could offer, and they had prevailed, but the victory was not clean or simple or glorious. It was necessary and it was sufficient, and it was bought at a price that only they fully understood. In the end, Edson's Ridge was about more than tactics or strategy or even victory. It was about what happens when men are placed in impossible situations and choose to stand rather than run. It was about the discovery that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite fear, to keep fighting when every instinct screams for flight, to trust in the men beside you even when the darkness is full of death. The Marines who defended that ridge in September of 1942 were not superheroes or mythical warriors. They were ordinary young men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them not because they were special, but because they refused to be anything less than what their corps and their brothers demanded. That refusal, multiplied across 800 individuals over 2 nights of unrelenting combat, was enough to turn the tide of a campaign and begin the long, bloody march across the Pacific that would end 3 years later in Tokyo Bay. The jungle breathes at night on Guadalcanal, as it always has, as it always will. The ridge still rises above Henderson Field, though the airstrip is long abandoned and the jungle has reclaimed what man briefly took. But the name remains, carved into the history of a corps that does not forget its battles or the men who fought them. Edson's Ridge. Bloody Ridge. A place where 800 Marines stood against the darkness and held, and in holding changed the war, changed the world, changed themselves in ways both terrible and profound. Their story deserves to be told not as propaganda or myth but as truth. Hard, painful, costly truth about what war demands of those who fight it and what they sacrifice in the fighting. They were there, on that ridge, in those nights, and they held. That is their monument, more permanent than any stone or bronze. Written not in glory but in blood and resolve and the simple, extraordinary fact of their endurance.